The biggest empire in the history of the world was the British Empire, and the British Empire reached its greatest extent by 1920. The greatest empire before the British Empire was the Roman Empire. And here we see a map that shows us that by the early 2nd century, the Roman Empire had grown over a very long period of time from the city of Rome, clear through Britain, up to roughly the present-day border of England and Scotland, throughout North Africa, well into the Middle East, and through much of Eastern Europe. A truly massive empire. And we would expect that an empire this big, that lasted so long, would continue to touch us in some way. We would expect that there would be legacies of that empire that we live with every day, and that is the case. One of the ways ancient Rome touches us every day is in the calendar that we use. The calendar that we use was revised a bit in the Middle Ages, so it's not exactly the calendar set up at the direction of Julius Caesar, but it is roughly that calendar. We have a quote here from the ancient writer Plutarch, who gives us a little information about Julius Caesar's order to put this calendar together. The names of our months come to us from the Romans. Now, for the Romans, the first month was March, and so that helps to explain why September, which is related to the Latin word for 7, October, related to the Latin word for 8, November 9, December 10. That explains how that happens, because for the Romans the first month was March. But you can pause the video and look at this and see how when we refer to these months, then there's some legacy of the Romans that's working itself out in what we're saying. Our month July comes to us from Julius Caesar. Our month August, Caesar Augustus, right? Octavius, think of him that way. Okay, so this is another way that the Romans are still with us. One of the things we can do if we go to Washington, D.C. and visit the House of Representatives, on either side of the place where the Speaker of the House sits, you have a symbol there. That symbol is the fasces. Perhaps you've heard the word fascist, and that comes to us from Italy in the 1920s, and by the early 21st century that word fascist has come to mean kind of different things to different people. But the Roman fasces was a symbol of political power. And so there in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., you have this symbol on both sides of the Speaker of the House's seat. And the point is that this is where political power resides. If you go to Washington, D.C. and other places, but we'll focus on D.C., a lot of the architecture that you see will remind us of ancient Rome. Now, if we go back and look at this map, if we put on top of this map another map of Alexander the Great, so a Greek empire builder. So Alexander the Great, a Greek empire builder, built a substantial empire. And there's significant overlap, especially on the eastern side, the side to the right of the map. There's significant overlap. And we see there that the Romans make Greece part of the Roman Empire. And so the Romans will absorb and adopt a number of things from the Greeks. And one of the things the Romans pick up from the Greeks is architecture. So you see in the bottom, those are Roman ruins there, but the architecture is actually Greek. So the Romans pick that up, and then when the U.S. Capitol is built, a lot of the buildings are based on that model. And so there on the left we have the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. There on the left we have the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. On the right we have a Roman edifice from France, and you see the similarity in the style. So that style of building reminds us of the Romans. That's another way that the Romans touch us. Probably the way the Romans touch our lives most consistently is in the language that we speak. English is a Germanic language. As we've seen in previous discussions, there's a lot of Greek in English. We speak a lot of Greek. We speak even more Latin. English is a Germanic language, but there's a lot of Latin that's in English. If we speak Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, those are basically dialects of Latin. So what I've done here is I've underlined every word that comes from Latin. So even in that top box there, it says Rome's key language, Latin, is a basic element of Western European languages. And the underlined words there all come to us from Latin words. Down below, I have key lines from the U.S. Declaration of Independence of 1776. And I've underlined the words that are linked to Latin words. And then the same thing in the box on the side. I think there aren't very many sentences we get through, especially sentences that have multisyllabic words, that is, words of more than one syllable. We don't get through many of those sentences without using some Latin. So, for example, the word sentence comes from Latin. So we're constantly using Latin, and this is probably the way that the Romans touch us constantly, all the time. Well, as is usually the case, probably always the case, empire builders bring their cultures with them when they're building their empire. So we see this Roman architecture in Rome. We also see it in France. When we think of the Roman Empire, our mind doesn't go to France, but there are old Roman edifices, Roman ruins in France, in Greece, Athens. And so the Romans will go there and absorb Greece into the Roman Empire. But in some ways, the Romans will be conquered by aspects of Greek culture. The Romans will be very much influenced by Greek literature, by Greek philosophy, by Greek architecture, etc. Algeria, when we think of the Roman Empire, we don't think of North Africa. But that whole northern part of Africa is pulled into the Roman Empire. Syria, so the Middle East. In Israel, present-day Israel, there are Roman ruins. England, and if you go to the instance I know best is the town called Chester. And there's a part of old Chester, England, where you can see the Roman ruins there. I've been to a fort in Wales, in southwestern Britain, and I've seen Roman ruins there. I've seen Roman ruins in London. So it's pretty impressive, and you can see this stuff in many parts of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Turkey, etc. One of the things we can do if we want to learn a little bit about the Roman Empire is read the New Testament. But when we think of the New Testament, we don't think of it as sort of historical documents, right? Normally, if we go to church, if we go to Sunday school, if we have lessons about the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, we think of them in that way as spiritual documents, and they are that, as religious documents, and they are that. But of course, they were written at a certain moment in time. They were written in the first century. These documents that we put together in what's called the New Testament, they were written in the first century, and they were written in the context of the Roman Empire. And so one of the things I want to do is just look at a few passages that give us a little information about how the Roman Empire operated. So, of course, the writers of the New Testament don't sit down with the objective of telling us about the Roman Empire. Right? That's not their objective. But since they're writing within the context of the Roman Empire, we can get information from New Testament documents about the Roman Empire. Let's look at a few things. So one of the things to note is that the New Testament was written not in Latin. We've indicated that the language we most think of when we think of the Roman Empire is Latin. But of course the Roman Empire was a multilingual empire. People throughout the empire have their own languages. But then Latin, of course, is a major language. But there are two major languages, actually, Latin and Greek. And here you look at the map, the parts of the empire in blue, that's where you have heavy Greek influence. So it's interesting because this collection of documents called the New Testament written within the context of the Roman Empire, but not written in Latin, written in Greek, right? This dominant language of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Let's look at some passages. So here's a very familiar passage, when around Christmas time especially, comes from Luke chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Okay, so we have Caesar Augustus, right, Octavian, giving an order that a census should be taken. So we know who's in command. At the top of the hierarchy is Caesar, okay? But then we have this interesting reference, actually in the previous chapter of the book of Luke, that refers to Herod, king of Judea. And here we're talking about, roughly present-day Israel. So what do we notice? We notice that you've got the emperor, the Roman emperor, who ultimately is in command. But then at the local level, in Palestine, present-day Israel, there you have a local king who's ruling, right? And I think there are at least two reasons for this. One is efficiency. Obviously, an empire this huge, the emperor cannot micromanage all of this, all right? There's no way the emperor, Caesar Augustus, can micromanage all of this. So, just as a matter of efficiency, you have to have local rulers. But why don't they send someone from Rome to be in charge of this area? Here we have Herod, king of Judea. And I think here's something else. We gain some insight into how Rome operates. That within this empire, you have many, many, many different ethnic groups, many, many, many different linguistic groups. And the last thing Rome needs with an empire this big is a lot of trouble within the empire. The last thing we need are revolutions breaking out in different parts of the empire, right? The more of that kind of stuff we have, the harder it is to manage. So one of the ways, generally speaking, that Rome operates is we know who ultimately is in command, right? Caesar is in command. The image of Caesar is on the coins that we use. That's actually referred to in early Christian writings, right? There's a reference to the coins with Caesar's image on it. So we know ultimately who's in command. But day to day, in our day-to-day lives, we can sometimes forget that we live in the Roman Empire because we have local rulers managing our local areas. And in fact, you can read big chunks of the Gospels, that is the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You can read big chunks of those books and forget that you're reading something that took place within the context of the Roman Empire. And I think that tells us something important about how the empire operated. That ultimately, Rome is in command. Ultimately, Caesar Augustus is in command. But at least in a lot of cases, we let locals rule locally. And of course, they are accountable to Roman leadership. But we let locals rule locally in the language of the people, partly for reasons of efficiency, because Caesar can't do everything, and partly so that the people don't feel as if they're being micromanaged from Rome. We have this quote down there from the Roman historian Tacitus, and he writes about a king in Britain. He's writing about a king in Britain, Cogidumnus, I think might be the pronunciation of the name, King Cogidumnus, who maintained his unswerving loyalty. So you have this local king who's loyal to Caesar, and he was an example of the long-established Roman custom of employing even kings to make others slaves. Okay, so you have this local king who, in Tacitus's language, is presiding over the people who are enslaved by the Roman Empire. But the basic idea is that it's not Caesar Augustus trying to micromanage that area. It's a local king in Britain. So we have a reference to a local king in present-day Israel, Palestine, presiding over that local scene. We have a reference to, from the Roman historian Tacitus, a British king, or a king in Britain, presiding over that area. Same theme, though. Let's come to this one. So this comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew. And the photo there below, these are Roman ruins in present-day Israel. So let's look at this passage. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Now what's interesting is that in the previous chapters, we've had no direct references to Romans. No direct references to Romans, right? Now Jesus is, sort of making his way from one place to another. And out of nowhere, here comes a centurion. This is a Roman officer. And a centurion commands about 100 soldiers. So it's very interesting because the centurion just kind of comes from nowhere, but then the centurion symbolizes Roman military power because he's in command of about 100 Roman soldiers. So, are the Romans operating with a somewhat light touch? Because we can read chapter after chapter after chapter and almost forget that we're in the Roman Empire. Do the Romans operate with a fairly light touch to an extent? Yeah, seems like it. At the same time, are we continuously reminded as we move from place to place that the Romans are ultimately in control? Yeah. And so I think this is one of the things that we see operating in the Roman Empire. On the one hand, if you're not a problem, if you don't cause the empire problems, then the empire's not going to cause you any problems. You can carry on with your life. Your rulers are talking to you in your local language. You can almost forget that you live within the Roman Empire. On the other hand, we have a presence here. The Roman soldiers are here, right? And if there's a problem, we will be ready to step in. And we can kind of see how that might work out in this next passage. This comes to us in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, 6, 7. So this is from Matthew 5. If anyone, this is Jesus teaching, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt and hand over your coat as well. So if someone wants to sue you, take your shirt, hand over your coat. That's teaching 1. Teaching 2. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Right? That's teaching 2. Teaching 3. Give to the one who asks you and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. That's teaching 3. Let's focus on teaching 2. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, right? Well, who has the power to do that? Now, here's an interesting thing, that in the first century, when people heard that, or when people read that for the very first time, they would know exactly what Jesus is referring to. We don't. The only way we can know what he's referring to specifically in that second teaching is if we do a little historical research. And the person who could do that is the Roman soldier. A Roman could, kind of like that centurion, just kind of coming from nowhere and going up to Jesus and interacting with Jesus. A Roman soldier, you've almost forgotten that you live in the Roman Empire because the Romans kind of leave you alone, you carry on with your life. As long as you don't cause any problems, you're okay. But it is possible that a Roman soldier could just come up to you out of the blue and say, you need to carry this. And Jesus is saying, if the Roman soldier tells you to carry something for him 1 mile, do 2. Now that's, we could pause and talk about that. That's a pretty radical thing. And what are people going to think when they hear this teacher, basically say, make nice to the Romans, right? Or something like that. So it's an interesting thing when you think about how would people respond to hearing this teaching. But let's just focus on this. Who had the power to come up to you and say, you need to carry my stuff for 1 mile? Only Roman soldiers could. So that tells us something about how Rome operates. On the one hand, kind of a light touch. The local rulers are ruling. The soldiers are out there, but they're, for the most part, leaving us alone. Big sections of the Gospels, you almost forget you're in the Roman Empire. But it is possible for a Roman just to pull you out of the crowd and say, carry my stuff. We know where the power resides. And we actually see that in Mark chapter 15, the quote down below. A passerby named Simon, who was from Cyrene, was coming in from the countryside just then, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. So now we've come to the end of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is on the point of being crucified, also related to Rome. We'll talk about that in a different discussion. But you get the feeling this guy just happens to, come onto the scene when Jesus is carrying a cross. And a Roman soldier or Roman soldiers basically do what Jesus refers to in Matthew chapter 5. Carry this. And Simon, who perhaps had almost kind of forgotten he lives in the Roman Empire, now is all of a sudden is reminded because, oh, the soldiers are telling me I have to carry this. I have to carry this, right? So we know where the power is. Here we have a longer passage. And now we're coming to parts of the Christian writings in the New Testament where, the Roman Empire really does kind of come center stage. It comes to us in the person of Pontius Pilate. On the right there's an inscription that was found not too long ago in present-day Israel. And it's an inscription with the name Pilatus, Pilate, engraved on it. Pontius Pilatus, right? And so, just a physical reminder of the fact that, this guy, Pontius Pilate, was there. So Jesus has been accused of a lot of things. Now he's brought before the Roman leadership, right? Because the people who are against Jesus want Jesus to be crucified. And the local leadership don't have the power to crucify him. Only Roman leadership can say that someone needs to be crucified. So very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, the whole Sanhedrin, these are the local religious leaders, they made their plans. They bound Jesus, they led him away, they handed him over to Pilate. So Pilate's the Roman. Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "You've said so." The chief priests accused him. Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply. Pilate was amazed. So then the story goes on to say that, Pilate addresses the crowd. And, let's just look at it. So now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists. So these are people who actually, want to overthrow Rome, who had committed murder in an uprising against Roman power. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Pilate says, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Do you want me to release to you Barabbas or Jesus?" Pilate, it says here, Pilate knew that it was out of self-interest that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. Pilate says, "So what shall I do then with the one that you call the king of the Jews?" They shout back, "Crucify him." And Pilate says, "Why? What crime has he committed?" And then the crowd, continues to demand that Jesus be crucified. Now we're going to return to this because there's something really interesting going on here that we'll have to return to. But the thing I want to point out here is notice that Pilate is not eager to crucify Jesus. Pilate does not want to condemn someone to death via crucifixion unless that person has really done something to deserve it, right? Now, I think, the historical information we have about Pilate is that he was not a good guy, okay? So we don't want to try to be overly sympathetic to Pilate. But I do think it's right that, you read this passage, you read other passages in the Gospels about the trial of Jesus. You don't ever get the feeling that Pilate is eager to crucify this guy. Right? Pilate really, if he's going to order this guy to be crucified, there needs to be a reason, right? And it turns out that there is a reason Pilate does it, but it's not legal. It's not for legal reasons. Pilate doesn't see that there are legal reasons to crucify him. Pilate, we'll talk about it down the road why Pilate does it, but for now, let's just notice that Pilate is not eager to crucify this guy. And that tells us something about the Roman conception of justice. The Romans don't mind crucifying people. I mean, there's plenty of crucifixion going on in Rome, all right? They're not reluctant to crucify, but if we're going to crucify somebody, there has to be a good reason, right? The Romans are committed to the concept of justitia, justice. And if there's going to be crucifixion, there needs to be a good reason for it. A somewhat similar thing, and this is the last one to look at, comes just from the book of Acts. Here we have St. Paul, or Paul, who's being put on trial. Similar thing, Local leaders are very angry with Paul for what he's been teaching, and they want him dealt with. And so, he's in the process of being handed over to Roman power. Let's look at this. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice, so these are local rulers, arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. I told them that it is not the Roman custom. Here you go. Here's this idea. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves. Remember Pilate? It's like, so what have you done? He wants Jesus to respond. Right? So that's what's being referred to here. There's this Roman idea of justice. If someone's going to be crucified, if someone's going to be dealt with harshly, there needs to be some legal justification for it. So I told them it's not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar, because Paul was a citizen. Paul was a citizen of the Roman Empire. Jesus was not a citizen. Jesus lived within the Roman Empire, but was not a citizen. Paul was a citizen. If Jesus had been a citizen, Jesus could have said to Pilate, I'm a citizen and I appeal to Caesar. At which point Pilate would have, said, okay, you appeal to Caesar you will go. But Jesus was not a citizen. Paul was a citizen. And therefore, we don't have it in this passage here, but Paul was a citizen. And Paul said, I'm a citizen of Rome, and I appeal to Caesar. And the response is, you have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go, right? So it says, when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. Right? What kind of interest was this guy saying? He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. I found he had done nothing deserving of death. There it is again. This Roman focus on justice. That if someone is going to be executed, there needs to be a reason for it. We see this Pilate in this interaction with Jesus. We see it here again. Okay? But because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to His Majesty about him. Therefore, I brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. There it is again. Now this guy has appealed to Rome. We're going to send him to Rome. But what exactly are the charges, right? We need to, get this thing lined up. Right? If this guy's going to face serious consequences, there needs to be a reason for it. So in neither case, in the case of Jesus before Pilate, in the case of Paul here, in neither case do the Roman authorities seem eager to execute people. There needs to be a justification. There needs to be a reason for it. That tells us a little bit about how the Roman Empire operates. And then lastly, on the bottom right there, you have a passage from the Roman governor Pliny, and he's in present-day Turkey. And notice the similar language. In this case, Christians are being investigated, and the governor Pliny writes to the Emperor Trajan. He says, it is my practice, Lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt, for who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in the trials of Christians. I therefore postpone the investigation and hasten to consult you. Once again, we see a Roman who has the authority to order executions, but he's not eager to execute. He's not being hasty in ordering the execution of people. He wants to know what's the right way to proceed. So in these passages, we've got this passage from Trajan. We saw the earlier passage from Tacitus. We've seen these passages from the Gospels and from the book of Acts. We can put these things together and get a sense for how the Roman Empire operated. Now, there are a lot of other things we could look at. These are just a few examples, but we'll end it there.